Good evening, everyone. Tonight we're traveling back to ancient Rome, to one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the Roman Republic. We'll follow the rise of Julius Caesar, explore the tensions that divided Rome's powerful elite, and uncover the secret conspiracy that led to the events of the Ides of March. And finally, we'll witness the moment inside the Roman Senate that changed the course of Roman history forever. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the story of ancient Rome slowly unfold. A quiet journey through history, perfect to fall asleep to.
It is the morning of March 15th in the year 44 BC. Rome, the center of a vast and restless republic, slowly stirs to life beneath a pale spring sky. Merchants begin opening their stalls along narrow streets. Servants sweep the marble floors of wealthy households. Somewhere in the distance, the steady clatter of carts echoes across the stone roads as farmers and traders bring their goods into the city. Yet, on this particular morning, a quiet tension hangs over parts of the city. For within Rome walks a man whose name is known across the entire Mediterranean world: Gaius Julius Caesar. To some, he is a brilliant general and a reformer who brought glory and prosperity to Rome. To others, he is something far more troubling, a man whose ambition threatens to destroy the Republic itself. And on this day, his life will come to an end. Caesar moves through the city surrounded by attendants and political allies. He is heading toward a meeting of the Roman Senate, the ancient governing body that for centuries has guided the affairs of the Republic. But the Senate will not be meeting in its usual location today. The familiar Senate house in the Roman Forum is undergoing renovations. Caesar himself ordered the construction of a new and more magnificent building that will bear his name. Until that project is completed, the Senate has been gathering elsewhere. Today's meeting will take place at the Curia of Pompey. The building stands on the eastern edge of a large stone courtyard known as the Portico of Pompey. The complex was originally built by Caesar's former rival, the famous general Pompey the Great, as part of an enormous theatre and public square. Compared to the crowded Roman Forum, the Portico is quieter and more secluded. Tall columns surround the open courtyard. Marble statues stand silently along shaded walkways. The sounds of the busy city seem distant here. The Curia itself is a modest rectangular hall where senators gather to debate laws, plan military campaigns, and decide the fate of nations. Yet today, this quiet place hides something far more dangerous. Near the entrance to the portico, a group of gladiators lingers casually. At first glance, they appear unremarkable. Professional fighters resting before some future performance. Their armor glints faintly in the morning light. Some lean against the stone walls, while others speak quietly among themselves. But their presence is no accident. They are here for a reason. Inside the Curia, members of the Roman Senate slowly gather. Many speak in hushed voices. Others avoid conversation entirely, pacing the room or staring silently toward the entrance. The atmosphere is uneasy. Some senators glance toward the doors again and again, waiting for Caesar. At the front of the chamber stands a golden ceremonial chair, a seat reserved specifically for the dictator himself. It gleams brightly against the darker wood and stone of the chamber. Before long, footsteps echo through the hall. Julius Caesar enters. He walks calmly toward the front of the room, dressed in a richly colored toga that reflects his immense authority. Though he is now in his mid-50s, his presence still carries the confidence of a seasoned commander. He takes his place in the golden chair. From the outside, everything appears ordinary, a Senate meeting about to begin. Yet there is one noticeable absence. Caesar's closest ally and co-consul, Mark Antony, is nowhere to be seen. Moments earlier, he had been walking beside Caesar, but just outside the building, he was stopped by another senator who drew him into conversation. The delay seems innocent enough, but it is anything but accidental. Mark Antony is a powerful and loyal supporter of Caesar. he is also physically imposing, a large, battle-hardened soldier who would likely intervene if he suspected danger. And so, while Caesar sits alone inside the Curia, Antony is deliberately being kept outside. The stage is now prepared. Across the chamber, a senator rises slowly from his seat. He begins walking towards Caesar. But to understand why this moment is about to unfold, we must step back many years earlier, long before the morning of March 15th. For the story of Caesar's assassination did not begin with daggers hidden beneath togas. It began decades earlier with the rise of one of the most extraordinary figures in Roman history. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in the year 100 BC into an ancient Roman family. The Julian clan claimed an illustrious heritage. According to legend, their lineage traced all the way back to Iulus, the son of the Trojan hero Aeneas, and through him, they believed themselves descended from the goddess Venus. Whether or not anyone truly believed this myth mattered less than the prestige it carried. In Roman society, ancestry was everything. Yet despite their noble lineage, the Julian family was not especially wealthy during Caesar's youth. Nor were they among the most powerful political dynasties in Rome. The Republic was dominated by a small circle of aristocratic families whose influence stretched back generations. Young Caesar would have to carve out his own path. From an early age, he showed signs of remarkable ambition. Roman politics was fiercely competitive. Advancement required charisma, alliances, military success, and often a willingness to take enormous risks. Caesar possessed all of these qualities. But his early life was not easy. When he was still a young man, Rome was shaken by brutal internal conflict between rival political factions. One of the most powerful figures during this period was the dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla viewed Caesar with suspicion because of Caesar's family connections to his political enemies. At one point, Sulla demanded that Caesar divorce his wife, who belonged to a rival political faction. Caesar refused. It was a dangerous decision. Sulla responded by stripping Caesar of his inheritance and forcing him to flee Rome. For a time, Caesar lived as a fugitive. Yet even during this difficult period, stories began circulating that hinted at the bold personality he would later become famous for. One such story occurred during his travels across the Mediterranean. Caesar was captured by pirates. Pirates were a common threat in those waters during the 1st century BC. Wealthy Romans were often kidnapped and held for ransom. When the pirates demanded 20 talents of silver for Caesar's release, he reportedly laughed and insisted they ask for 50. He felt they were undervaluing him. During his captivity, Caesar behaved not like a prisoner, but almost like their leader. He joined their games, gave them orders, and even warned them that once he was freed, he would return and punish them. The pirates found his arrogance amusing, but Caesar was serious. After his ransom was paid and he was released, he quickly gathered a small fleet, hunted down the pirates, and captured them. True to his word, he had them crucified. Stories like this spread through Rome, shaping Caesar's growing reputation as a man of daring confidence. In the years that followed, his political career advanced steadily. Roman politics followed a traditional sequence of offices known as the cursus honorum, the path of honor. Ambitious men progressed step by step through positions such as quaestor, aedile, praetor, and eventually consul, the highest elected office in the Republic. Caesar climbed this ladder with remarkable skill. He was an excellent speaker, capable of swaying crowds and Senate debates alike. He also understood the importance of public image. While many aristocrats focused primarily on the interests of the Senate, Caesar often positioned himself as a champion of the common people. He supported popular reforms and sponsored lavish public games that entertained the masses. This earned him enormous popularity. But popularity was expensive. To finance these events, Caesar accumulated massive debts, yet he seemed unconcerned. For Caesar understood something fundamental about Roman politics. Debt could be repaid later, but influence and loyalty were far more valuable. And in time, his gamble would pay off. Around the year 60 BC, Caesar formed a political alliance that would transform the Republic. Two other powerful men joined him in this partnership. The first was Pompey the Great. Pompey had already achieved legendary status through his military victories. He had crushed pirates across the Mediterranean and expanded Roman territory deep into the Eastern world. The second was Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. Together, these three men formed an informal alliance that historians later called the First Triumvirate. Though it was never an official institution, their combined influence allowed them to dominate Roman politics. Each man supported the other's ambitions. Caesar secured the consulship in 59 BC. After his term ended, he was granted command of several Roman provinces in the north, including Gaul. At the time, Gaul was a vast and largely unconquered region that covered much of modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany. For Caesar, it was the perfect opportunity. A Roman governor with military command could lead legions, win victories, and accumulate both wealth and prestige. Over the next 8 years, Caesar launched a series of campaigns that would become some of the most famous military operations in Roman history. He defeated powerful tribal confederations, crossed the Rhine River into Germanic territory, and even launched expeditions across the English Channel into Britain. His legions followed him through forests, mountains, and rivers, and with each victory, his reputation grew. But the campaigns were also brutal. Entire tribes were destroyed. Villages were burned. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed or enslaved. War in the ancient world was rarely gentle. Yet in Rome, these victories made Caesar a hero. His soldiers became fiercely loyal to him. They admired his willingness to share hardships with them. He marched alongside them, ate the same rations, and rewarded bravery generously. By the end of the Gallic Wars, Caesar had become one of the most famous and powerful men in the Roman world. And that power began to frighten many members of the Senate. While Caesar was winning victories in the distant lands of Gaul, the delicate political balance back in Rome was beginning to shift. The alliance that had once secured his power was slowly unraveling. The First Triumvirate had never been a stable arrangement. It was not built on friendship or shared ideals, but rather on mutual advantage. Each of the three men, Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, had their own ambitions, and as long as those ambitions aligned, the alliance held. But circumstances rarely remained favorable forever. The first blow to the partnership came in 53 BC. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome and one of the triumvirs, embarked on a military campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east. Crassus was eager to win the same kind of military glory that both Pompey and Caesar had achieved. But the campaign ended in disaster. At the Battle of Carrhae, Roman forces were overwhelmed by Parthian cavalry and horse archers. Crassus himself was killed, and his army was shattered. With Crassus gone, the balance of power within the triumvirate was broken. Now only two dominant figures remained, Caesar and Pompey. At first, their relationship remained cordial. Pompey had even married Caesar's daughter Julia years earlier, strengthening the bond between the two men. But tragedy struck again. Julia died in childbirth in 54 BC. Her death removed the personal connection that had helped maintain peace between Caesar and Pompey. Without Crassus to balance their power, and without Julia to unite them, the two great figures of Rome gradually drifted toward rivalry. Meanwhile, many members of the Roman Senate were growing increasingly uneasy about Caesar's expanding influence. Reports of his victories in Gaul continued to arrive in Rome. With each new triumph, his fame grew. He had not only conquered vast territories, but had also gained the loyalty of experienced legions. These soldiers had spent years campaigning under his command. They trusted him, admired him, and in many cases felt personally indebted to him. To the Roman aristocracy, this was deeply unsettling. The Republic had always feared the concentration of military power in the hands of a single individual. Rome's history contained painful lessons about what could happen when ambitious generals turned their armies toward the city itself. And so, gradually, political factions began forming within the Senate. Many senators rallied behind Pompey, who was still considered a defender of the traditional republican order. Pompey himself had once been an ally of Caesar. But as tensions increased, he began aligning more closely with Caesar's political opponents. By the late 50s BC, Rome had effectively split into two camps. On one side stood Caesar, still commanding his legions in Gaul. On the other stood Pompey and a powerful coalition of senators determined to limit Caesar's authority. For several years, both sides watched one another carefully. No one wished to be the first to provoke open conflict. But the political situation was becoming increasingly unstable. Caesar's command in Gaul was not permanent. Eventually, his term as governor would end, and he would be expected to return to Rome as a private citizen. Under normal circumstances, this would not have been particularly dangerous. But Caesar had made powerful enemies. Without the legal protection that came with his military command, he would be vulnerable to prosecution. Roman politics was often ruthless. Charges of corruption, abuse of power, or illegal conduct could easily be brought against former officials. Convictions could result in exile, financial ruin, or worse. Many of Caesar's rivals were already preparing legal cases against him. To Caesar, it seemed clear. If he returned to Rome without his army, his enemies would attempt to destroy him politically. And so the standoff between Caesar and the Senate continued, growing more tense with each passing year. Finally, in 49 BC, the situation reached a breaking point. The Senate issued a formal order. Caesar was commanded to relinquish his military command and return to Rome immediately. Pompey was appointed to defend the Republic. For Caesar, this was an impossible demand. If he obeyed, he would surrender his protection and place himself at the mercy of his enemies. If he refused, he would be openly defying the Senate. For several days, Caesar considered his options. Then, in January of 49 BC, he made a decision that would change Roman history forever. With a single legion of loyal soldiers, Caesar marched south toward a small river in northern Italy. The river was called the Rubicon. It was not particularly large or impressive. In fact, by modern standards, it would barely be considered a river at all. But politically, it marked a very important boundary. Roman law strictly forbade generals from bringing their armies into Italy itself. This rule existed to prevent military leaders from threatening the Republic. Any general who crossed the Rubicon with armed forces would be committing an act of rebellion. As Caesar approached the river, he paused. According to later historical accounts, he hesitated for a moment before giving the order to advance. Then he reportedly spoke the words that would become famous throughout history. "The die is cast." With that simple phrase, Caesar led his legion across the Rubicon River. In doing so, he began a civil war. News of Caesar's advance spread quickly through Italy. Many of his enemies had not expected him to act so boldly. Pompey and much of the Senate fled Rome, retreating south, and eventually crossing the Adriatic Sea to gather forces in Greece. Caesar entered the city of Rome without resistance. But the conflict was far from over. Over the next 4 years, the Roman world was consumed by war. Armies marched across Italy, Spain, Greece, North Africa, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Roman fought Roman in battles that would determine the future of their state. One of the most decisive confrontations occurred in 48 BC at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. There, Caesar faced Pompey's larger army. Despite being outnumbered, Caesar's experienced legions achieved a stunning victory. Pompey fled the battlefield and escaped to Egypt, hoping to find refuge there. But fate would not be kind to him. When Pompey arrived in Egypt, the young king Ptolemy XIII and his advisors made a fateful decision. They believed that presenting Pompey's death to Caesar would win them favor. And so, as Pompey stepped ashore, he was betrayed and murdered. His severed head was later presented to Caesar as a gift, but Caesar was not pleased. Though the two men had become rivals, Pompey had once been his ally and even his son-in-law. Seeing Pompey's remains reportedly brought Caesar to tears. Still, the war continued. More campaigns followed in Egypt, North Africa, and Spain as Caesar pursued the remaining supporters of the Pompeian faction. Gradually, one by one, his enemies were defeated. Finally, in March of 45 BC, Caesar achieved the last major victory of the civil war at the Battle of Munda in Spain. The conflict that had begun with the crossing of the Rubicon was finally over. Caesar returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The Senate, which had once opposed him so fiercely, now found itself in a difficult position. Many senators had supported Pompey, but Caesar chose not to punish them harshly. Instead, he pursued a policy of remarkable leniency. Former enemies were pardoned. Some were even given positions of honor within the government. Caesar believed that reconciliation would stabilize the Republic after years of conflict, but his mercy would later prove to have unintended consequences. For among those who received his forgiveness were men who would one day participate in the conspiracy against him. Meanwhile, Caesar began implementing sweeping reforms. He reorganized the calendar, creating a new system that would later become known as the Julian calendar. He initiated public works projects throughout Rome. He settled veterans on land across the empire and expanded citizenship rights in various regions. To many ordinary Romans, these changes were welcome, but to certain members of the aristocracy, they were deeply troubling. For Caesar's power seemed to grow with each passing month. He was granted multiple consulships. Statues of him appeared across the city. His image was placed on coins, something that had previously been reserved only for gods. Finally, in February of 44 BC, the Senate granted Caesar a title that would alarm many of his critics. He was declared Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. For centuries, the Roman Republic had avoided the rule of kings. The very word king carried terrible associations in Roman political culture. The last Roman monarch, Tarquin the Proud, had been overthrown nearly 500 years earlier. Since that time, Romans had fiercely guarded their system of shared power and elected offices. Now, many feared that Caesar intended to bring monarchy back to Rome. Perhaps he never intended to crown himself king. But appearances mattered, and to many senators, it seemed that the Republic itself was slipping away. It was during this uneasy time that whispers of conspiracy began to spread quietly among Rome's political elite. Some senators feared Caesar's ambition, others resented his dominance. A few simply believed they were defending the ancient traditions of the Republic. And slowly, quietly, a group of men began meeting in secret. They would later call themselves the Liberators. Their goal was simple. Julius Caesar had to die. In the months following Caesar's victory in the Civil War, Rome outwardly appeared calm. The city continued its daily rhythms. Markets opened at sunrise. Senators debated legislation. Soldiers returned from distant campaigns. Public festivals filled the streets with music and celebration. But beneath this appearance of stability, unease lingered. For many members of Rome's traditional aristocracy, the republic they had inherited from their ancestors no longer seemed secure. Caesar's authority had become overwhelming. He controlled the government, commanded the loyalty of powerful legions, and enjoyed immense popularity among the Roman people. To his supporters, this made him a necessary leader. a man capable of restoring order after years of civil conflict. But to his critics, it looked very different. They saw a man whose power was growing too quickly and whose ambitions might one day reshape the Roman state entirely. It was within this atmosphere that a small group of senators began quietly discussing an extraordinary possibility. They began discussing the removal of Caesar by force. At first, these conversations were cautious and uncertain. Killing the most powerful man in Rome was not a decision to be taken lightly. Any attempt would carry enormous risks. Failure would mean execution. Even success could plunge the Republic back into chaos. Yet for some of these men, the alternative seemed worse. Gradually, their private conversations became more serious. The group that eventually formed would number around 60 conspirators. But at the center of the plot stood several key figures. One of the most important among them was a man named Gaius Cassius Longinus. Cassius was a seasoned soldier and politician. Years earlier, he had served under the Roman general Crassus during the disastrous Parthian campaign that ended at the Battle of Carrhae. Cassius survived that defeat and managed to lead the remnants of the army safely back to Roman territory. Later, during the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, Cassius had sided firmly with Pompey. After Caesar's victory, Cassius expected punishment. But instead, Caesar pardoned him. Not only was Cassius forgiven, but he was allowed to resume his political career. On the surface, Cassius accepted this mercy. Yet privately, he remained deeply resentful. Cassius was known among his contemporaries as a thoughtful but intense man. He possessed a sharp intellect and a strong sense of personal pride. Some historians believe he also carried a deep jealousy of Caesar's success. Whatever the precise mixture of motives, Cassius gradually became convinced that Caesar's power posed a serious threat to the Republic, and so he began seeking allies. One of the men he approached was Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus would later become the most famous participant in the conspiracy. But his relationship with Caesar was complicated. Brutus came from a distinguished Roman family, with strong ties to republican ideals. His ancestors had played a legendary role in Roman history. Nearly 5 centuries earlier, a man named Lucius Junius Brutus had led the revolt that overthrew Rome's final king, Tarquin the Proud. According to Roman tradition, that ancient Brutus helped establish the Republic itself. The name Brutus therefore carried powerful symbolic meaning in Roman political culture. Marcus Brutus grew up deeply aware of this heritage. Yet despite his family's reputation, Brutus had once fought against Caesar during the Civil War. Like Cassius, he had joined Pompey's side. And like Cassius, he had been pardoned after Pompey's defeat. In fact, Caesar showed Brutus particular kindness. Some ancient writers even speculated that Caesar may have felt a special affection for him, perhaps due to a long friendship with Brutus's mother. Caesar not only forgave Brutus, but also promoted him. He appointed Brutus to important offices and treated him with notable respect. For a time, Brutus appeared loyal, but the growing political situation placed him in a difficult position. Many senators who opposed Caesar began urging Brutus to take action. They believed his name, associated with the overthrow of kings, would give legitimacy to any resistance against Caesar. Cassius understood this very well. He knew that without Brutus, a conspiracy might appear to be nothing more than a group of disgruntled politicians seeking revenge. But with Brutus involved, the plot could be presented as an act of patriotic duty. According to ancient accounts, Cassius approached Brutus repeatedly. He argued that Caesar's accumulation of power threatened the freedom of the Republic. He reminded Brutus of his ancestors' role in overthrowing tyranny, and gradually, Brutus began to consider the possibility that drastic action might indeed be necessary. Historians still debate the precise moment when Brutus decided to join the conspiracy. But once he did, the movement gained momentum. More senators were quietly invited to participate. Another important figure was Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus. Unlike Marcus Brutus, Decimus had been a longtime supporter of Caesar. He had served as one of Caesar's generals during the Gallic Wars and had fought loyally during the Civil War. Caesar trusted him deeply. In fact, Decimus was named as one of the secondary heirs in Caesar's will, an extraordinary mark of confidence. Yet Decimus eventually joined the conspiracy as well. His motives remain somewhat mysterious. Some historians believe he feared being overshadowed by Caesar's growing dominance. Others think he may have been persuaded by friends who believed the Republic must be preserved. Whatever the reason, his participation proved crucial because Caesar trusted him, and that trust would later allow the conspirators to guide Caesar directly into danger. Other senators soon joined the plot. Some had supported Pompey during the Civil War. Others had personal grievances against Caesar. A few simply believed they were acting in defense of Rome's ancient political traditions. But despite their shared goal, the conspirators faced many practical challenges. Assassinating Caesar would not be easy. He was often surrounded by supporters, and although he did not maintain an official bodyguard while inside the city of Rome, something that would have been seen as tyrannical, he frequently traveled with loyal companions and veterans. Any attack would require careful planning. At first, the conspirators debated several possible methods. One proposal suggested killing Caesar while he walked through the streets of Rome along the Via Sacra. This road was often crowded with citizens, which might allow assassins to blend into the crowd. But the plan carried serious risks. In such a public place, Caesar's supporters could intervene. And if the attack failed, the conspirators would likely be killed immediately. Another idea involved pushing Caesar from a bridge while armed men waited below to ensure his death. This scheme, too, was eventually rejected. It seemed unreliable and overly complicated. A third proposal suggested striking during a gladiatorial event. Assassins could disguise themselves as fighters and attack Caesar amid the chaos of the arena. Yet again, the conspirators hesitated. They feared innocent spectators might be harmed, and the resulting confusion could make it difficult to control the situation. Eventually, they settled on a different location, a meeting of the Roman Senate. Senate sessions provided a rare opportunity. All senators were expected to attend. Weapons were technically forbidden inside the Senate chamber, meaning Caesar would not expect danger, and the enclosed setting would limit interference from outsiders. The conspirators chose a specific meeting scheduled for the 15th day of March. The date held particular urgency. Soon after this meeting, Caesar planned to depart Rome on a new military campaign. He intended to march eastward against the Parthian Empire, the same powerful kingdom that had defeated Crassus years earlier. If Caesar achieved success in this campaign, his prestige would grow even further. He might return not only as Rome's dictator, but also as the conqueror of one of the greatest powers in the ancient world. For the conspirators, that possibility was unacceptable. They believed the time to act was now. And so, quietly and carefully, they prepared for the day that history would remember as the Ides of March. As the winter of 44 BC slowly gave way to early spring, the conspirators began preparing for the moment that would define their lives. Their meetings were careful and discreet. Rome was a city full of whispers, rumors, and political intrigue, and the men involved understood that even the smallest hint of their plans could bring disaster. A single servant overhearing a careless conversation, a suspicious ally reporting strange behavior, or even a rumor spreading through the crowded streets could expose everything. So they spoke quietly. They met in private homes, away from large gatherings. They avoided discussing details in public places where curious ears might linger. Some of them even avoided being seen together too often, fearing that patterns might attract attention. Yet, despite these precautions, the group slowly grew. Word spread among those senators who were already uneasy with Caesar's growing authority. Some joined out of conviction, others out of resentment. A few, perhaps out of fear that refusing the invitation might make them enemies of men who were already preparing something dangerous. By the time their plans were complete, roughly 60 men had agreed to take part in the plot. Not all of them would strike Caesar directly. In fact, only a smaller number would actually carry daggers into the Senate chamber. But each conspirator had a role. Some would surround Caesar, others would create distractions. A few would ensure that important allies of Caesar were kept away. One of the most important problems the conspirators faced was Mark Antony. Antony had been Caesar's loyal supporter for many years. He had served under Caesar during the campaigns in Gaul and had proven himself both brave and fiercely devoted. Physically, Antony was a formidable man, tall, broad-shouldered, and hardened by years of military life. In a chaotic struggle inside the Senate chamber, he might easily intervene and disrupt the assassination. For this reason, the conspirators agreed that Antony needed to be separated from Caesar at the crucial moment. Originally, some conspirators proposed killing Antony as well, but Marcus Brutus objected strongly. Brutus believed their actions needed to appear as the defense of the Republic, not a bloodthirsty purge of Caesar's allies. If too many men were murdered, the public might see them not as liberators, but as violent conspirators. In Brutus's view, Caesar alone must die. And so, the conspirators settled on a simpler plan. On the morning of the Senate meeting, Antony would be drawn aside into conversation by a senator named Gaius Trebonius. Trebonius was trusted enough to approach Antony without raising suspicion, and his task would be simple: keep Antony outside the chamber long enough for the attack to occur. Meanwhile, inside the Senate building, the conspirators would position themselves carefully around Caesar. The assassination itself would begin with a signal. That signal would come from Tullius Cimber, another senator involved in the plot. Cimber planned to approach Caesar with a petition asking that his exiled brother be pardoned and allowed to return to Rome. Such petitions were common in Roman politics. When Caesar inevitably refused, or at least delayed giving an answer, Cimber would grab Caesar's toga and pull it aside. That movement would be the signal. At that moment, the conspirators surrounding Caesar would draw their hidden daggers and strike. To bring these weapons into the Senate chamber without attracting attention required some creativity. Daggers were concealed inside wooden boxes, normally used to carry writing tablets and official documents. Once inside the building, the conspirators would quietly retrieve the blades and hide them beneath their togas. Everything was prepared carefully, but there remained one final element that helped make their plan possible. It involved a group of gladiators. These gladiators were owned by Decimus Brutus, one of Caesar's trusted associates and one of the conspirators themselves. On the day of the Senate meeting, these men would gather casually near the portico of Pompey. Their presence would seem ordinary enough. Gladiators were common sights in Rome, often traveling with their trainers and awaiting future games. Yet their true purpose was far more sinister. They were there as a form of insurance. If Caesar somehow managed to escape the Senate chamber, the gladiators would be nearby to ensure that he did not get far. Ironically, Caesar would not find their presence suspicious. He trusted Decimus Brutus, and because the gladiators belonged to Decimus, their appearance near the building would seem perfectly natural. With all of these preparations in place, the conspirators now waited for the appointed day. The Ides of March. In the Roman calendar, the Ides referred to the middle of the month. For March, that meant the 15th day. To most Romans, it was simply another date. But as the day approached, strange stories began circulating about ominous signs and troubling omens. Romans of this period took such things seriously. Religious rituals, sacrifices, and interpretations of divine signs were deeply woven into everyday life. According to ancient accounts, Several unusual events occurred in the days leading up to Caesar's death. One of the most famous stories involves a soothsayer named Spurinna. Spurinna was a religious figure who practiced a form of divination common in Roman culture. Through the ritual sacrifice of animals, priests would examine the organs, especially the liver, searching for signs that the gods might be sending warnings or guidance. At one such sacrifice, Spurinna reportedly discovered something deeply troubling. When the animal's chest cavity was opened, its heart was missing. To Roman observers, this was an alarming sign. The heart represented life itself. To find an animal without one, suggested that some great misfortune might soon occur. Spurinna warned Caesar that danger lay ahead. He advised him to be cautious as the Ides of March approached. But Caesar, though respectful of Roman traditions, was not known for excessive superstition. He acknowledged the warning, yet continued with his plans. Still, the strange signs did not end there. According to later historians, Caesar's wife Calpurnia experienced a disturbing dream on the night before the Senate meeting. In her dream, she saw the roof of their house collapse. She imagined herself holding Caesar's body in her arms, lifeless and covered in blood. When she awoke the next morning, she was deeply shaken. She begged Caesar not to attend the Senate session that day. Calpurnia believed the dream was a warning, and for a brief moment, Caesar seemed to hesitate. Even a man as confident as Caesar might feel uneasy when so many troubling signs appeared at once. To be certain, he ordered further sacrifices and consulted additional religious advisors. The results were not encouraging. Several of the rituals produced unfavorable omens. At this point, Caesar reportedly decided to cancel his appearance at the Senate meeting. Word was sent that the session would be postponed. For the conspirators, this unexpected decision created a sudden crisis. If Caesar remained at home, their carefully prepared plan would collapse. And worse still, suspicion might arise. Fortunately for them, one man was in a position to intervene. That man was Decimus Brutus. Because of Caesar's deep trust in him, Decimus was able to enter Caesar's home without difficulty. There, he spoke calmly with the dictator. He appealed not to superstition, but to pride. If Caesar cancelled the Senate meeting simply because of ominous dreams and questionable omens, what would the senators think? Would it not appear weak? Would the ruler of Rome allow himself to be guided by fearful interpretations of dreams? Decimus suggested that Caesar attend the meeting as planned. If the omens truly troubled him, he could simply dismiss the Senate quickly once he arrived. The argument was persuasive. Caesar reconsidered his earlier decision, and so, as the morning progressed, preparations resumed. Soon, Caesar would make his way through the streets of Rome toward the Curia of Pompeii, toward the Senate meeting, toward the moment that history would remember for centuries. The morning of March 15th gradually unfolded across the city of Rome. Spring had begun to return to Italy, and the air carried a gentle coolness that lingered in the shaded streets. As the sun rose higher above the tiled rooftops, the city slowly filled with the sounds of everyday life. Merchants called out to customers in busy marketplaces. Laborers hauled carts of goods through narrow alleyways. Citizens gathered in small groups to discuss politics, business, and the latest rumors drifting through the capital of the Republic. For most Romans, this was simply another ordinary day. Yet for a small group of men, the day carried a far greater significance. Throughout the city, the conspirators quietly made their way toward the portico of Pompey. They traveled separately. Some arrived early, entering the Senate building with the calm composure expected of Roman politicians. Others lingered nearby, waiting for the meeting to begin. Each man carried with him the knowledge that the events of the day would change the course of Roman history. Many of them had likely slept poorly the night before. Though they had convinced themselves of the necessity of their actions, the reality of what they were about to do must have weighed heavily upon their thoughts. To kill the most powerful man in Rome was no small matter. Meanwhile, at his residence, Julius Caesar prepared to leave for the Senate. Despite the earlier hesitation caused by Calpurnia's troubling dream and the unfavorable omens reported by religious advisors, Caesar had ultimately decided to attend the meeting. Perhaps Decimus Brutus's arguments had reassured him. Perhaps Caesar simply refused to allow superstition to dictate his actions. Or perhaps, like many powerful men throughout history, he believed that fortune favored boldness. Whatever his reasoning, Caesar soon departed his home and began the journey toward the Senate meeting. As he moved through the streets, a number of attendants and supporters accompanied him. Along the way, citizens greeted him with respect. Caesar had become an immensely popular figure among the Roman people. His victories had expanded the Republic's territory, and many of his reforms had benefited ordinary citizens. To them, he was not a tyrant. He was a hero. Yet even as Caesar walked confidently through the city, danger waited ahead. At one point during his journey, a man approached him in the street. This man carried a scroll. According to historical accounts, he urgently pressed the document into Caesar's hands and begged him to read it immediately. The message, he insisted, concerned Caesar personally. What Caesar did not know was that the scroll supposedly contained details of the conspiracy against him. Inside were the names of several conspirators and a warning that his life was in danger. But Caesar, perhaps distracted by the crowd or eager to reach the Senate meeting, did not stop to read the document. Instead, he continued walking. The warning remained unopened. In later centuries, this small moment would become one of history's most tragic ironies. For had Caesar paused to read that message, the entire course of Roman history might have unfolded very differently. Eventually, Caesar arrived at the portico of Pompeii. The large courtyard stretched out before the Senate building, surrounded by elegant columns and decorated with statues of Roman heroes. The complex itself had been built years earlier by Pompey the Great, the very man Caesar had defeated during the Civil War. There was a certain symbolism in holding the Senate meeting here, yet Caesar showed no sign of discomfort. Among the columns of the portico, several gladiators lingered quietly. They appeared relaxed, chatting casually, or leaning against the stone pillars. To an observer, they looked like fighters waiting between performances. But in truth, they were there as part of the conspiracy. The gladiators belonged to Decimus Brutus. Their presence helped ensure that no unexpected interference would disrupt the events about to unfold. As Caesar approached the entrance to the Senate chamber, he was joined by his co-consul, Mark Antony. The two men had worked closely together for years. Antony was fiercely loyal to Caesar and had proven himself a capable military commander. But before the pair could enter the chamber together, another senator stepped forward. This was Gaius Trebonius. Trebonius greeted Antony warmly and began speaking with him. The conversation seemed ordinary at first. Perhaps they discussed Senate business or some minor political matter. Yet Trebonius had a very specific purpose. His task was to keep Antony outside, and so he continued the conversation, drawing Antony slightly away from the entrance. Inside the Senate chamber, the conspirators waited. One by one, they had already taken their places among the gathered senators. Beneath their flowing togas, hidden from view, were the daggers they had secretly brought into the building earlier that morning. The air inside the curia was tense. Some conspirators may have tried to appear calm, speaking quietly with nearby colleagues or pretending to review documents. Others likely avoided eye contact altogether. Every man present knew what was about to happen. When Caesar finally entered the chamber, the room grew still. He walked toward the front of the hall where the golden ceremonial chair had been prepared for him. This chair symbolized the extraordinary authority that Caesar now held. As dictator for life, he stood above the traditional political offices that had once balanced power within the Republic. Caesar sat down. The Senate meeting was about to begin. Yet something was missing. Mark Antony was not beside him. Trebonius had succeeded in keeping him outside. For the conspirators, everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Now they only needed the signal. Across the chamber, Julius Caesar slowly rose from his seat. He began walking towards Caesar. The moment had arrived. Inside the Curia of Pompeii, the Senate chamber had grown unusually quiet. Dozens of senators were present, seated along the wooden benches that lined the hall. Their white togas created a sea of pale fabric beneath the dim interior light. The air felt heavy, almost still, as if the room itself sensed that something unusual was about to unfold. At the front of the chamber, Julius Caesar sat in his golden ceremonial chair. He appeared calm. To Caesar, this meeting was likely just another moment in a long career filled with political debates, decisions, and negotiations. Over the years, he had presided over countless gatherings of the Senate. There was little reason, at least on the surface, to believe this one would be any different. Across the room, Julius Caesar approached. His steps were measured and deliberate. In his hands, he carried the petition he had prepared, the request that his exiled brother be allowed to return to Rome. Such petitions were not uncommon. Senators frequently approached powerful officials to request favors, political concessions, or acts of clemency. As Caesar drew closer, several other senators quietly rose from their seats. They moved towards Caesar as well, speaking in support of Caesar's request. To an outside observer, the scene might have appeared routine, a group of senators gathering around the dictator to plead a case. But the circle was tightening, closer and closer still. Caesar stopped directly in front of Caesar. He began speaking loudly, repeating his request that his brother be pardoned and allowed to return from exile. Caesar listened briefly. Then, according to the historical accounts that survive, he calmly refused. The matter could be discussed later, he explained. But Caesar did not step away. Instead, he continued pressing the issue. His voice grew louder. Other senators joined in, calling out in support of the petition. For a moment, the chamber filled with overlapping voices. Then, suddenly, Caesar reached forward. With a sharp motion, he grabbed Caesar's toga and pulled it downward from his shoulders. This was the signal. Caesar reacted instantly, startled and angered by the sudden gesture. He reportedly exclaimed in protest. But before he could rise from his chair, another senator moved forward. Publius Servilius Casca. From behind Caesar's shoulder, Casca drew a concealed dagger. In one swift movement, he struck. The blade slashed towards Caesar's neck or shoulder. The exact target remains uncertain in the historical sources. The wound was not immediately fatal, but it was enough to shock the room into chaos. Caesar jumped to his feet. Turning quickly, he attempted to defend himself. One account suggests that he grabbed Casca's arm. Another claims that he tried to strike back with the stylus, the small metal pen used for writing on wax tablets. But in that moment, the rest of the conspirators surged forward. Daggers flashed beneath, their togas. The circle around Caesar collapsed inward. One blade struck, then another, and another. The attack quickly became a frenzy. More than 20 men had joined the assault. Each conspirator, eager to prove his loyalty to the cause, thrust his dagger toward the dictator. The narrow space around Caesar filled with bodies, raised arms, and flashing steel. Amid the chaos, several of the attackers accidentally wounded one another. In such close quarters, the violence was uncontrolled and frantic. Meanwhile, a few senators who were not part of the conspiracy attempted to intervene, but they were quickly pushed aside. The sudden violence had thrown the chamber into confusion. Some men fled in panic. Others froze in disbelief. Within moments, Caesar was overwhelmed. According to ancient accounts, he received 23 stab wounds. Many of these wounds were inflicted after he had already begun to collapse. One of the most famous moments described by later writers involves Marcus Brutus. During the attack, Brutus stepped forward and struck Caesar as well. When Caesar saw him among the attackers, the sources claim he spoke a brief phrase. The exact words remain debated by historians. Some later writers claimed Caesar said the famous line, "Et tu, Brute," meaning, "You too, Brutus." Other ancient sources suggest he may have spoken in Greek instead, or perhaps he said nothing at all. In the chaos of the attack, it is impossible to know with certainty. But the symbolism of that moment, the betrayal by a man Caesar trusted, has echoed through history for centuries. As the daggers continued to fall, Caesar's strength began to fade. Realizing that resistance was hopeless, he reportedly stopped struggling. Some accounts say he pulled part of his toga over his face, perhaps as a final gesture of dignity. Moments later, he collapsed to the floor. His body fell at the base of a statue. The statue depicted Pompey, the Great, the rival Caesar had defeated during the Civil War. It was a strange and bitter coincidence. The man who had once been Caesar's greatest political opponent now stood above him in silent stone. Blood pooled on the marble floor beneath the statue's feet. And there, beneath the image of his former rival, Julius Caesar died. The attack had lasted only minutes. When it was over, the conspirators stepped back. Some were breathing heavily. Others stared silently at the lifeless body before them. The most powerful man in Rome was dead. The dictatorship had ended, or so they believed. For a brief moment, the chamber remained still. Then, slowly, the conspirators raised their blood-stained daggers. They began shouting words that they hoped would define their actions. They called themselves liberators. They declared that Rome was free. But outside the Curia, the world had not yet begun to react. The consequences of their actions were only beginning. And the future, they had imagined, the restoration of the Republic, would prove far more difficult to achieve than they expected. For a few quiet moments after the attack, the Senate chamber remained frozen in stunned silence. The violence had happened so quickly that many of the senators present had barely understood what they were witnessing. Only seconds earlier, the room had been filled with the usual sounds of political debate. Now the marble floor was stained with blood. Julius Caesar lay motionless beneath the statue of Pompey. Around him stood the men who had carried out the assassination. Some still held their daggers in their hands. Others looked around the chamber as if suddenly unsure of what to do next. Their plan had succeeded, but the future they had imagined was far less certain. Slowly, the conspirators began to gather themselves. A few called out to the remaining senators, urging them not to be afraid. They insisted that their actions had been necessary. Rome, they claimed, had just been freed from tyranny. Several of them raised their blood-stained blades into the air and shouted the word libertas, freedom. But the reaction inside the Senate chamber was not what they had hoped. Many of the senators who had not been involved in the plot were horrified. Some fled the building immediately, terrified that more violence might follow. Others simply stood in stunned disbelief, unable to process what had just occurred. The conspirators had imagined that their fellow senators would greet Caesar's death with approval. Instead, the room emptied quickly. Within minutes, the Curia of Pompeii was nearly deserted. The body of the dictator remained on the floor where he had fallen. Outside the building, the situation was equally uncertain. Mark Antony was still speaking with Trebonius when the sounds of confusion began to drift from within the Senate chamber. At first, the noise may have seemed like the normal commotion of political disagreement, but soon it became clear that something far more serious had happened. Word spread rapidly. Caesar had been attacked. Antony reacted immediately, recognizing the danger he might be in if the conspirators decided to target him as well. He fled the area, reportedly disguising himself in the clothing of a servant to avoid recognition. Meanwhile, the conspirators cautiously emerged from the Senate building. They walked into the open courtyard of the portico of Pompey, still carrying their daggers. Some of the blades were still stained with blood. They called out again to those nearby, proclaiming that they had acted in defense of the Republic. But the response they received was not enthusiastic. The citizens who witnessed the scene did not celebrate. Instead, confusion and fear spread quickly through the surrounding streets. People began whispering among themselves. Had Caesar truly been killed? Who had done it? And what would happen next? Rome had seen violence before. Civil wars, riots, and political murders were not unknown in the long history of the Republic. Yet this moment felt different. The most powerful man in the Roman world had just been assassinated in the middle of a Senate meeting. No one could be certain what consequences might follow. The conspirators soon realized that remaining in the Senate building was dangerous. If Caesar's supporters organized quickly, they might seek revenge. And so, the conspirators began making their way through the streets of Rome together, heading toward one of the city's most defensible locations, the Capitoline Hill. This hill had long been one of the symbolic centers of Roman political life. Temples stood there, including the great temple of Jupiter. The location was elevated and easier to defend. If violence erupted in the city, the conspirators could hold the hill until the political situation became clearer. As they moved through the streets, they continued to proclaim their message. They insisted that Caesar's death had been necessary. They claimed that the Republic had been saved. Yet, the reaction of the Roman population remained uncertain. Some citizens watched silently. Others hurried home, fearful that more violence might soon erupt. Many people in Rome had admired Caesar. He had been generous to the poor, sponsored public festivals, and brought glory to Rome through his military victories. To them, the news of his assassination was not a cause for celebration. It was a cause for anxiety. Meanwhile, Caesar's body remained where it had fallen. For some time, no one dared approach it. Eventually, a small group of loyal servants arrived and carefully lifted the body onto a litter. They carried it away quietly through the streets. The once mighty ruler of Rome was now gone, and the city he had ruled stood at the edge of uncertainty. As the afternoon slowly passed, word of Caesar's death spread throughout Rome. The story traveled quickly from house to house, across marketplaces, through taverns, and along crowded streets. Everywhere people asked the same question: what would happen now? For the conspirators, the answer seemed simple. They believed that with Caesar gone, the Republic would naturally restore itself. The Senate would resume its traditional authority. The old political balance would return. But they had misunderstood something important. Power in Rome had already begun to change. The Republic had been weakened by decades of political conflict and civil war, and Caesar had left behind allies who would not allow his death to pass unanswered. Among them was the man who had escaped the Senate chamber earlier that day, Mark Antony. And before long, another figure would step onto the stage, a young man who would inherit Caesar's name and eventually reshape the Roman world in ways the conspirators could never have imagined. As the afternoon of the Ides of March slowly faded into evening, Rome remained unsettled. The conspirators had taken refuge upon the Capitoline Hill, gathering near the temples that overlooked the city. From that elevated ground they waited, watching and listening as news of the assassination spread through the streets below. They had expected their actions to be greeted with relief. In their minds, they had saved Rome. For generations, Romans had celebrated the overthrow of kings and the creation of the Republic. The conspirators believed that by killing Caesar, they had followed in the footsteps of those ancient defenders of Roman liberty. Yet the reaction from the people of Rome was far less enthusiastic than they had imagined. Instead of cheering crowds, there was uncertainty. Instead of celebration, there was silence. Many citizens simply did not know what to think. Caesar had ruled with extraordinary authority, but he had also been generous to the common people. His victories had expanded the empire, bringing wealth and prestige to Rome. He had provided public games, distributed land to veterans, and introduced reforms that benefited many citizens. For these reasons, large portions of the population admired him. And so, the city waited. Meanwhile, in a modest house somewhere in Rome, Mark Antony began considering his next move. Antony had narrowly avoided the fate that had befallen Caesar. Had he entered the Senate chamber that morning, he might easily have been struck down alongside his friend and ally. But now that Caesar was gone, Antony found himself in a dangerous and uncertain position. He was one of Caesar's closest supporters, and the conspirators might still see him as a threat. At the same time, Antony understood that Caesar's death had created a massive political vacuum. Who would now lead Rome? The conspirators hoped the Senate would reclaim its traditional authority, but Antony knew that Caesar's supporters, including many soldiers and ordinary citizens, would not simply disappear. Carefully, cautiously, Antony began reaching out to both sides. He opened negotiations with the conspirators. He also made quiet preparations to secure Caesar's political legacy. For the moment, Antony avoided direct confrontation. Instead, he focused on gaining control of an important symbol of power, Caesar's funeral. In Roman culture, funerals for prominent figures were major public events. They were opportunities not only to honor the dead, but also to influence public opinion. If Antony could shape the narrative surrounding Caesar's death, he might be able to turn the mood of the city in his favor. The conspirators, perhaps believing that tensions were already calming, agreed that Caesar should receive a public funeral. It was a decision they would soon regret. Several days later, the funeral ceremony began in the Roman Forum. Large crowds gathered to witness the proceedings. Many people were still curious, still uncertain about the meaning of the events that had taken place. At the center of the ceremony stood Mark Antony. As Caesar's former co-consul and loyal supporter, Antony had been chosen to deliver the funeral oration. He began calmly. At first, his speech seemed measured and respectful. He acknowledged that Caesar had been an extraordinary figure. He spoke about Caesar's victories and his contributions to Rome. Then, gradually, the tone of the speech began to change. Antony reminded the crowd that Caesar had refused the crown when it had been offered to him earlier. He described Caesar's generosity toward the Roman people, and then he spoke about the assassination itself. According to historical accounts, Antony dramatically displayed Caesar's blood-stained toga. The garment was torn by the many wounds inflicted during the attack. As Antony pointed to the holes in the fabric, he explained which conspirator had delivered each blow. The effect on the crowd was powerful. The quiet uncertainty that had filled the forum began to shift. Murmurs spread through the assembled citizens. Anger began to replace confusion. By the time Antony finished speaking, the atmosphere had changed completely. The crowd that had gathered for the funeral was now deeply emotional. Many people wept. Others shouted in anger at the conspirators. Some demanded revenge. Soon, the situation spiraled beyond control. The crowd seized Caesar's funeral bier and carried it through the streets. In a spontaneous display of grief and fury, they built a funeral pyre in the middle of the forum itself. Flames rose into the evening sky as Caesar's body was cremated before thousands of witnesses, and as the fire burned, the anger of the crowd grew stronger. Groups of citizens began roaming the streets, searching for the conspirators. Several houses belonging to the plotters were attacked and damaged. The men who had believed themselves to be liberators now found themselves in serious danger. One by one, the conspirators fled the city. Some escaped to the eastern provinces. Others sought refuge with sympathetic allies. But the fragile political balance of the Republic had been shattered. And in the months that followed, new figures would emerge to claim Caesar's legacy. One of them was Mark Antony. But another was about to arrive in Rome. He was young. He had little military experience, and few people yet understood how important he would become. His name was Gaius Octavius, and soon he would be known to history as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. In the weeks that followed Caesar's funeral, Rome slowly settled into a tense and uncertain calm. The city had witnessed a sudden explosion of emotion during the funeral procession, but now the crowds had dispersed and the streets returned to their familiar rhythms. Merchants reopened their stalls. Senators resumed cautious discussions. Messengers carried news across the vast territories of the Republic. Yet beneath the surface of everyday life, the political landscape had changed forever. Julius Caesar was gone. And in his absence, many powerful figures began quietly positioning themselves to shape what would come next. Among them was the young man who had only recently arrived in Rome. His name was Gaius Octavius. At the time of Caesar's assassination, Octavius was only 18 years old. He had been studying and receiving military training in the eastern provinces when the news reached him that his adoptive father had been murdered. Few people in Rome initially regarded him as a serious political figure. He was young, relatively inexperienced, and overshadowed by far more established leaders, such as Mark Antony. Yet Octavius possessed qualities that would soon become very clear. He was patient, he was careful, and he understood how power in Rome truly worked. Soon after arriving in the city, Octavius learned the full contents of Caesar's will. The document had been opened and read publicly during the funeral ceremonies. In it, Caesar had made a remarkable decision. He had adopted Octavius as his son and primary heir. This meant that Octavius would inherit Caesar's name, his fortune, and, perhaps most importantly, his political legacy. From that moment forward, Octavius became Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, often shortened simply to Octavian. The young man now carried the name of the most powerful figure Rome had ever known, and with that name came influence. Many of Caesar's former supporters began looking toward Octavian as the rightful continuation of Caesar's leadership. But Octavian was not the only figure seeking to shape the future. Mark Antony remained one of the most powerful men in Rome. As a former general and loyal ally of Caesar, Antony had strong support among soldiers and veterans. At first, relations between Antony and Octavian were uneasy. Each man understood that the other represented both an opportunity and a potential rival, but the political situation soon forced them to cooperate. For Caesar's assassins were still alive. Many of the conspirators had fled Rome after the funeral riots and were gathering forces in the eastern provinces. Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, the two most prominent leaders of the conspiracy, had begun assembling armies. They believed they were continuing the struggle to preserve the Republic. But Antony and Octavian saw things very differently. Together with another influential Roman leader, Marcus Lepidus, they formed a new political alliance. Historians would later call it the Second Triumvirate. Unlike the earlier alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this new triumvirate was officially recognized by Roman law. Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus were granted extraordinary powers to restore order to the Republic. In practice, this meant they now controlled the Roman state. One of their first actions was a brutal campaign known as the proscriptions. Lists of political enemies were published throughout Rome. Anyone whose name appeared on these lists could be legally killed and their property confiscated. The proscriptions were ruthless. Thousands of people were executed or forced into exile. Even some prominent senators and former allies were targeted. One of the most famous victims was the great Roman orator Cicero, who had criticized Antony openly. Cicero was captured and executed, his head and hands displayed publicly in the Forum as a warning to others. With their enemies in Rome eliminated, the triumvirs turned their attention eastward. There, the armies of Brutus and Cassius awaited them. The two forces finally met in the year 42 BC, near the city of Philippi in northern Greece. Two major battles were fought. The fighting was intense and chaotic. But in the end, the forces of Antony and Octavian were victorious. Cassius, believing the battle lost, took his own life. Soon afterward, Brutus did the same. With their deaths, the last major leaders of the conspiracy were gone. The men who had killed Julius Caesar in the name of the Republic had ultimately failed to preserve it. In fact, their actions had produced the opposite result. Instead of restoring the old system of shared power, Caesar's assassination had triggered a chain of events that made the rise of a new form of government almost inevitable. Over the following years, tensions developed even within the triumvirate itself. Rivalries grew, alliances shifted. Eventually, Octavian and Mark, Antony would face one another in a final struggle for control of the Roman world. But that is another story. For now, it is enough to say that Octavian would ultimately emerge victorious. And in the year 27 BC, he would take on a new title, Augustus. With that title, he became the first official emperor of Rome. The Roman Republic, the system that had governed the city for nearly 5 centuries, had quietly come to an end. In its place stood the Roman Empire. And in a strange twist of history, the empire that replaced the Republic would be built largely on the legacy of the man whose assassination had once been meant to save it, Julius Caesar. Even in death, his influence continued to shape the Roman world. His name would become synonymous with authority. Future emperors would adopt the title Caesar as part of their own names. The word itself would eventually travel across languages and centuries. In German, it would become Kaiser. In Russian, it would become Tsar. And throughout history, the shadow of Julius Caesar would linger over the idea of imperial power. Yet on that quiet afternoon in March of 44 BC, none of this could have been fully understood. All that remained in that moment was a lifeless body on the floor of a Senate chamber, a group of men who believed they had saved their country, and a city standing quietly at the edge of an uncertain future. History often turns on moments that seem sudden and dramatic, but when viewed from a distance, those moments are usually the result of long and complicated stories. Ambition, fear, loyalty, betrayal. The assassination of Julius Caesar was not simply the fall of one man. It was the turning point of an entire political system, and in the centuries that followed, historians, writers, and philosophers would continue to debate the meaning of that moment. Was Caesar a tyrant whose power threatened the freedom of Rome? Or was he a visionary leader whose reforms might have stabilized a troubled republic? The answers remain uncertain. But the events of the Ides of March remind us of something timeless about history. Power rarely disappears quietly, and even the most carefully planned actions can lead to consequences no one fully expects. As the sun set over Rome on that distant evening in 44 BC, the city slowly returned to its usual rhythms. The streets grew quieter. Torches flickered along the walls of houses and temples, and somewhere in the darkness, the future of Rome was already beginning to take shape.
Still awake? If you are, thank you for spending this quiet time with us, exploring the ancient world together. But now it's time to let your mind rest. We hope this journey through history helped you slow down, unwind, and drift a little closer to sleep. And we hope you get the deep rest you need to conquer your day tomorrow. Until next time, sleep well and good night.